Hey there, it's Rachel Mullins, the host of #NoFilter Fridays on Public House Media.
Welcome to the Leadership Revolution podcast. We want to take a moment and say how happy and honoured we are that you have chosen to take time out of your week to join us today. We're excited to have you with us. If this is your first time listening, our vision is to build healthier families and communities through education and leadership, which begins by leading ourselves from the heart. We invite you to be fully present as you listen and judge later, because it's not easy to do both at the same time. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hi, my friends. I am David, your host of the Leadership Revolution, and I have the privilege to serve you every other week as your guide. We are continuing our series, Where Do We Go From Here? And I am excited about our guest today, Crystal. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. A little bit more about Crystal. She's an experienced leader and educator who has demonstrated a history of working with primary and secondary education. And she's skilled in K through 12. She has a master's in education. She's a doctoral candidate for leadership and professional practice with a primary focus on strategic change and organizational development. Wow, that is a mouthful. Like, what got you into education, Crystal?
That's a really good question. And it was one of the questions that I thought you might ask. And it's a really difficult answer because I really don't have a good answer. I graduated from high school at the age of 18 and was pretty confident and certain that I wanted to be a starving artist in New York City and have my own studio and just, enjoy exploring the urban areas and doing my art and things like that. But the longer I was in college, the more interests I discovered that I had. And I discovered that I had a love for writing and a love for reading. I discovered that I had a love for geology. And the list goes on. I found something positive and really fun and engaging about almost every class that I took through college. And so after about my second year in, I thought, what better way to combine all of the things that I love than to go into education. And so that was kind of the start of my career. And I have just stuck with it through all 20 or so years and worked my way into what I do now, starting as a teacher.
Wow. So did you have like a teacher in your life that influenced you in a positive way to even plant that seed, potentially what you're doing now?
I had a lot of teachers that planted a lot of seeds. I wouldn't say that I had one particular teacher that pushed me into education. Most of my teachers were very supportive around my art and getting that piece off the ground, as well as my athletic career in college. So the thought of going into education didn't come until later in life, closer to the time that I started my own family, which was also very young.
So getting into the education industry, like what was some of the biggest challenges you faced leading up to it? So you said, yes, this is what you're interested in. You said geology? Yes, geology. This is the first time I've ever heard someone interested in that. That's amazing. Love it. What were some of the challenges you faced earlier on?
Early on, some of the challenges that I faced were being very, very young, getting into the public school system. I think I was probably around 20 years old, coming in as a student teacher. And that was in inner city Detroit. East Detroit was the neighborhood. And it was right around 8 Mile, which was the neighborhood that I lived in. So that was very challenging, entering a middle school off of 8 Mile, in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Detroit, and not having much of an age gap. So when I entered middle school early on in my career, I had my nose ring, and I had my dyed hair, and I learned really quickly that I needed to try to create some boundaries between where I was at as a professional and where I was at as a young person, being able to empathize and relate to a lot of those kids that I worked with. And so I had to be very careful about those boundaries in the workplace, and not necessarily around anything inappropriate, but really wanting to set a good example as far as being a role model and modeling for those students what my expectations were, what I believed that they had the potential to grow into, and kind of setting the stage as their educator versus, a peer or someone that I could relate to with where they were at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm curious to hear about your experience, because I grew up in the inner city public school system, and I remember growing as predominantly Black and Hispanic. So when we would see a person of white background coming to our school, just like game on, time to be disruptive and mischievous and to run them out of school. And I'm not proud of it. God has saved me, but I was one of those troubled youth that ran teachers out of the classroom. So how was your experience in an inner city school when at the age of 20? What was that like for you?
Sure. By the time I got to East Detroit, I was probably closer to 22, somewhere in there, 23. It was intimidating at times, for sure, but I don't think that it was necessarily intimidating because of any cultural diversity that was happening. It was intimidating because of the demographic diversity that was happening. We had a lot of poverty. We had a lot of substance abuse, a lot of transiency. And our school was also a turnaround school. The school that I worked in was a turnaround school. And so we had lots of administrative turnover. The typical challenges that you would probably find just about anywhere in any urban school. But it's not to say that those things couldn't be adapted and overcome as well. So there was a lot of training involved, there were a lot of conversations around what we had the power to control locally, which would be in our building, as a team of educators, and coming up with some problem-solving strategies that we could use to do the work at the most local level, and in ways that we had the most impact with the students that we worked with, ended up being our primary focus. And those were the conversations that happened in the teacher's lounge and in PLCs and things like that.
That's amazing. And talking about controlling the environment, the building that you all are in as educators, how did you see the training impact the students who you all were serving? Like, did it progress them in a healthy way, or were there red tapes around what you could and couldn't do?
There were definitely, limitations on what we could and couldn't do. It's really hard. We were just talking about this morning in our CPI training. It's really hard as an educator to not want to take responsibility for some of the less fortunate situations that you see, the less fortunate experiences that you see. But really, a healthier way of looking at those situations is shifting that conversation away from taking responsibility as an educator for things that you cannot take responsibility for, and making that shift from wanting to take responsibility for those things that you don't have any control over, and instead teaching students how to be empowered and build capacity for where they are so that they can do that themselves. And that's a much healthier mindset, but a much more difficult mindset to be able to achieve, because we're in education because we do care and we do have passion and we do want to see our students, be successful and grow into successful citizens of society. But the only real way that we can do that during the time that we have them is by empowering them with the tools that they need to be able to achieve that, or with the tools that they need to grow the capacity themselves so that they can achieve that.
Wow. Empowering the learners, I think that's profound, because I'm a product of the public school system, and I've been on both sides of the aisle. I went to public schools and I went to a private college, and I've seen the difference of being disempowered and being empowered, and how that's helped me as a person, as a man. Now, when you're experiencing empowered learners, like how, that's not a good question. Scratch that one. We're still going. What does it feel like when you see an empowered learner experience that they're empowered? Does that
makes
sense?
Total sense?
Okay.
Yeah. So I think what that really comes down to is giving them their why. Or that's a bad answer. Teaching them to search for their why. We don't want to give them their why, but we definitely want to teach them to search for their why. And that can be equated to their purpose, right? And so when we're talking about teaching and learning, the question then should be, why is this learning experience meaningful to you? Or how can I make this learning experience meaningful to you? And the way that we do that is by connecting those concepts to the real world. So how and in what ways are you going to take our learning objective today and then apply it in the real world? What is it about this concept that's going to give it meaning for you? What do you plan to do with it? And that can be as granular as, addition and subtraction, or it can be as global as creating an initiative, for a project and doing work out in the real world. And some of that comes with different in age too, right? Mm-hmm. Difference in age. Whereas a 5-year-old's capacity is going to be this big, and it might be around addition and subtraction, but the capacity of a senior in high school is going to be much larger. And so empowering a senior is going to be a little bit different and look a little different than empowering a 5-year-old.
You said something that's key. You said purpose, giving them the ability to search for their whys and helping them ultimately find their purpose. And I know that you're a PhD candidate right now, right?
Correct. And
my question to you is, what do you think your purpose is, Crystal?
I feel like my purpose is to do the greatest amount of good that I can with the audience that I can reach and the amount of time that I'm here on Earth. And right now, my place is in education. And so I have a responsibility as a leader to try to do that in my school, in my district, and in my community. So that's my why right now. Professionally, personally, my why is huge also. My kids have always been in education with me from the time I was a kindergarten teacher all the way up through my administrative career. They've gone to school with me, they hop in the car and they mess up my classroom before school and they mess up my classroom after school. And then when I moved into an office, they started doing it to my office too. I'd be lying and remiss if I didn't mention goldfish squished into the carpet of my office at the end of the day sometimes. But my why is very closely aligned. that question kind of reminds me of a training that I went to a few years ago. I like to think of myself as a fairly new administrator. And your first year in administration is sort of like having a baby. They kind of give it to you, a baby for the first time. Let me clarify, having a baby for the first time. And you're given this school, and, the message is keep it alive. And so, you get this thing and you're told to keep it alive, and then you start wondering why it's crying or, what it needs. And being a first year administrator is sort of like that. And it's building the plane while you're flying it. And it's learning along the way. And you really have to approach that from a very humble lens, because if you can't reach out for help when you need it, it's going to be a tough year. But anyways, the training that I went to about 3 years ago, I had a big realization in my administrative career, and it was probably my second year in. And the trainer at the end of the day said, I want you all to take out your cell phones. And so we did. And he said, I want you to think about someone in your life that you really care about. And so, that was pretty easy for me. And he said, I want you to send him a text. And the only thing that your text is going to read is what is one thing that I do that gets in the way of my relationship, or that gets in the way of our relationship. And so I shot that text off. And the next day we came back to the training. It was a 2-day training. And the trainer said, how many of you did your homework? And most everybody in the room did their homework. And just to give you some context, these were all administrators. So principals, assistant principals, and a few superintendents from Pikes Peak and Denver region. And so the next morning, we all came, and 2 or 3 people did not raise their hand, didn't do their homework, which is natural. And the trainer said, okay, so you shot this text off, you've all gotten your responses. How many of you were surprised by the response that you got? Like totally shocked, had no idea that you were doing these things that were getting in the way of the relationship. And I think 1 or 2 people out of about 20 raised their hand. And so what that tells us is that most of us know exactly what we're doing that gets in the way of our relationships with other people. We just either aren't ready to do the work yet, or we don't know how. And so the response that I got was from my kids, and they said, you get mad over little things. And what that told me was, I know that I am not managing things well, right? I'm working way too much as an administrator. I was working in the evenings and on the weekends, and I wasn't taking the time that I needed for those other parts of my life, which was making me a really good administrator. I was putting a lot of work into being an administrator, but I was not necessarily putting in the work in the other areas of my life to find that balance. And so really taking the time to think and reflect on that over the last couple of years, which is something I do a lot, has taught me as an administrator that the authenticity piece is really important. Because what I was doing was trying to be one person at work, and then coming home and trying to be a different person at home. And so I really started intentionally doing that work, and really trying to be as authentic as possible from the time I woke up until the time that I went to bed, so that the experiences that I was creating for all of the people that I cared about and all of the relationships that I cared about were more consistent.
Wow. So as we explore, where do we go from here? I'm extracting what you said, like the principles. You talked about humility and having a humble heart and being willing to reach out if you need help, versus trying to do this Lone Ranger type of thing. And then you said reflective, like after you sent that text off, you had to reflect on how it made, your children feel. And that's powerful. And then receptive, right? It's one thing to be reflective, and then taking a step further is receptive to the feedback in what you got and the pivot you had to make from that. And as a leader, do you think those 3 things are important? Being humble, being reflective, and being receptive, especially during a time like COVID-19?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes, obviously. if I could see your notes, those were three things that you just said. Being humble, I think comes from this idea that right now, there's just a lot of background noise happening right now. The pandemic started in March. It's an election year. We've got several political movements that are happening in the media. There's just kind of this constant noise in the background. And what that does is it puts a little more pressure on our day-to-day, right? So things that normally would feel a little stressful feel a little more stressful right now.
Yeah.
And so I think, as far as your question around COVID and what's happening in education right now, remaining humble allows us the opportunity to be more accepting of what each individual family really needs. And it's really coming down to a matter of preference, right? So what works for your family may not work for another family, and what works for another family may not work for another family. And every family is so unique and has so many different situations. The noise right now that's happening, especially around the election and things being so politicized, is we have these really strong ideas of what we think should be right and what we think should be wrong. And what we're neglecting to do is stay in that humble mindset and that humble heart set, and be open and accepting to each preference and what the rationale is for that preference. And then in turn, supporting, it's okay for us to disagree, and it's okay for you to do things that work for your family a different way than maybe something that might work for my family. But what we really need to do right now is make sure that we are coming from a supportive stance for each individual preference, and what works for those situations right now. What was the second one? I'm sorry.
It's okay. It was being reflective.
Oh, being reflective. Yes. I think that's just a habit that we should be in as leaders all the time. Nobody's perfect ever.
What?
Nobody's
Seriously?
perfect ever. My principal and I just earlier this week held a meeting, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare, and it could have gone better. It wasn't horrible, but it couldn't have gone better. And the second the meeting was over, we met about it and we had a conversation, a very real and accountable conversation. How do you think that went? What should we have done? What could we have done? How are we going to make it better next time? What was the response? What's the feedback? It's a very selfless and service-oriented profession that we work in. And so we have to be able to take our own judgments and put those aside and welcome the judgments and the opinions of others, because ultimately it is their experience that we are creating. And so we need to do the work in order to make that a good one for our students, for our families, for our staff, for all stakeholders that are really involved.
Wow. And the last one is receptive. How do you see that playing in leadership in all levels,
Sure.
especially in education?
Sure. Being receptive is very important, but that does not mean that we should discredit the boundaries and the limits that we also should be setting around, the more obvious things like professionalism and compassion and respect and things like that. So yes, we do need to absolutely be receptive. And in doing so, like I said, search for understanding, listen for understanding, and really explore the rationale behind some pieces of feedback that we may disagree with at times.
You said something so powerfully. You said to listen for understanding. And one of my favorite books by Stephen Covey, hopefully I've done him justice, 7 Habits of Effective People, of Highly Effective People. Do you remember that book? Okay. I probably butchered that one. But he talks about in one of the habits to seek to understand in order to be understood. And you said it so well, especially in education, and even in our political the political era that we're in right now with what's going on. It seems like there's a lot of division versus connection, and we're no longer seeking to understand the other sides of the aisle. We're looking to be understood, and then that breaks down human connection. And you mentioned it so eloquently. You said compassion, and the word compassion means to suffer with that person or with someone. And with all that's going on, where do you see education going as a whole with all of this politics getting involved, COVID's happening,
That's
and
a
then
good question.
and foundations of what we've done in the past? How do you see that changing?
Sure. Well, two things. I have always believed that where you have conflict, you have passionate people. And that's a good problem to have, right? I think right now, especially, what we're seeing is somewhat of a lack of modeling. And by that, I mean, where we have conflict, we have passion, but that also can be summed up as diversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we have diversity at the table, especially when it is around problem solving, that's where good ideas happen, and that's where good compromises happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we need to do is shift those conversations from an AB conversation to a more global conversation, especially when it comes to an organization. So we will come to the table, especially as leaders, with strong voices and strong opinions and strong beliefs and strong values, and we believe in something. But I also think that our why is what we have in common, and that is we all want to do what's best for kids, right? And so your beliefs and your values are as equally as important as mine,
Mm-hmm.
Even though they may be different. And so what we can do there is model for our kids what that diversity looks like, and what healthy conflict resolution looks like, and what healthy compromise looks like. Because in the end, we're going to come out of this as a team, as a group, as an organization. And the decision that's made, we all need to be on board with if we're going to move the organization forward, right? We can't go in as a team of 10 people and come out with one person's idea and expect everyone to be on board. So we're going to have to make some compromises there. And what that means is I get to put a little piece of myself into this decision that's going to be made, but I'm going to own it 100% with the rest of the team that I have here, because we all have the same why and we all care. We all have the same motivation, and we all have the same outcomes in mind, even though it may look a little bit different. And that, I think, is what we're seeing a little bit of lack in as far as the modeling side of things. How do we have a healthy conversation? How do we bring in the tools that we know that we already have, like pausing and paraphrasing, asking to understand, putting ideas on the table? These are all skills that we're trained in. And you can have as much heart as you want, but without some of those skills, the outcome isn't going to be as impactful as maybe it could.
You said so many great points. I'm like, which one to go off of? Talking about when you have conflict, you have passionate people. And what we're experiencing now is a lack of modeling, and we need to have a global conversation. And what it makes me think about is every time I go to the doctor, before they do anything with me, they ask me a series of questions. Like, have you experienced this? What's going on here? So they have an understanding to move forward effectively. And what you're alluding to is having that global conversation of what are the needs of the children versus what are our needs as adults, and focusing, you talked about our purpose is what connects us, and focusing heavily on the education and the children's education and what's going on with them. How can you see that in your own environment of pushing, okay, let's focus on education versus focus on our personal needs? Like, because I believe we're all selfish. I'm selfish, and my kids will say that, and my wife will say that at times. But how do we move from selfishness to selflessness?
That's a really difficult question, but I think the answer there is also surrounding yourself with a diverse team and surrounding yourself with people who are going to hold you to that standard, who are going to hold you accountable. And you have to be prepared for that. You have to want that, and you have to welcome that, because when the time comes for you to be called out and you need it, if you aren't receptive to that, then you aren't necessarily going to be, in your learning zone to being better tomorrow than you are today.
So accountability is what you said. So where do we go from here, having that social accountability to call you out when you're not doing what you need to get done, but in order to get you better or get the team better, and then having a diverse team? And oftentimes when we think of diversity, we think, okay, you have an African American, you have a Hispanic. No, but a diverse thinking, like people who are thinking outside the box, people who've come from different backgrounds. And I grew up in the South, so like we had potlucks, and everybody brings something, and with all of the dishes, it makes your plate a little bit better versus your traditional mac and cheese and mashed potatoes and fried chicken. Now you have some cornbread. Now you have some asparagus, and for vegetarians you have lentils. With all of this, all the stuff that's going on right now, with the politics, with COVID just interrupting education, and it's fair to assume that there's a lot of educators right now who are feeling a little discouraged with what's on the horizon or what's on the other side of this. What would you say to educators who are a little bit discouraged and give them a little inspiration?
I think what I would say to educators right now is, yes, obviously this is challenging, right? And we can't discredit the challenges that we are facing right now, because they're huge. With the goal of not stating the obvious, what I would probably tell most educators is that we need to try to remember to stay in a mindset that's going to keep us healthy mentally, emotionally, and physically, especially as leaders, because we then have to do that for other people, and teachers are leaders too, right? Because that's their students. And as parents, we're leaders for our kids too. So the word leader and leadership is universal and is relative also. But even more so, we have this profound opportunity to reshape education right now. And while it's coming with its challenges, it's also coming with its innovators. And the innovators are the ones that are coming to that diverse table and having those diverse conversations and saying, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. What are you experiencing? And what are you experiencing? What are the needs that we need to satisfy here? And what are some ideas that we can put on the table to make that happen? And some of them are going to work, and some of them are not going to work, and some of them are going to need tweaking along the way. And I think that's what's happening in education right now. In public schools that were built brick and mortar and built with the intention of having people in them are now trying to, figure out how to do this remote learning thing. But with that is coming innovation. We're a little bit better at it now than we were last March. And through some of those reflective practices that we were talking about earlier, we're then able to bring those diverse conversations to the table repeatedly to revise these systems. And then, we're seeing other forms of education that are popping up with innovation too. And the innovation are the ideas that are being put on the table to make those things happen. And those are the leaders that are starting to rise right now with, making sure that we're staying in that problem-solving mindset and bringing those conversations to the table with multiple people, not just one, to develop what education is going to look like, 3 years from now or 1 year from now.
Yeah.
And in some cases, even tomorrow.
Yeah. You said something I love, innovation. I am a millennial and I love anything tech. And if I can make anything work for me without working, I love it. It simplifies to give time back. And I've done some Facebook ads and pinpoint certain people and then have a little robot go follow them and then see their buying behavior on the internet. And it's creepy. But you talked about innovation, and right now we're experiencing a deep interruption. And I've often said, when most people see interruption, we see innovation. When people see problems, we see potential. When people see obstacles, we see opportunities. And like you said, we have a huge opportunity to make this great pivot in education. And you were talking about being a teacher, being a parent, and you're a leader, so we're modeling it. So when you think about the word leadership, what comes to mind?
Can I get back to you with that answer tomorrow?
We gotta record part 2
I need to reflect
tomorrow.
on this. I think the leadership piece is really that modeling piece. And that's the challenge right now for leaders too, because so many people are looking to us for all of the answers and we don't have them. And so we're really having to say, no, we really want you to put ideas on the table. We really want to hear your ideas right now. Because we just don't have all the answers, So it's going to be really important for us as leaders to constantly keep the mission and the vision and the why at the forefront and why we're showing up every day to do this. And that's because we have a love for our kids. And they still have a future coming at them, whether we like it or not. The sun's going to rise tomorrow and the moon's going to set tonight, hopefully. More than likely it will. I don't know. It's 2020.
Anything can happen.
Yeah, right. But I think that's really what it comes down to as leaders is just to make sure that we keep moving in a progressive direction, and we don't let things like this cause us to fall into, this stagnant education system that doesn't go anywhere from here. We have a responsibility to respond versus react for our kids. And in doing so, that comes with some tough decisions. And those tough decisions need to be made in the best way possible.
So what I extracted from what you just shared when I asked the question, what do you think about leadership? You said love, you said relationship, you said guidance, and you said purpose. Out of everything you shared, like having a love for the kids and then being in relation with the kids, so leadership is relationship, and then guiding them to where they need to go, and then making tough decisions for the betterment of everyone as a whole. Is that correct?
That's correct. But doing that as a team as well, thinking about my own school, we're constantly talking with teachers and collecting feedback because we genuinely want to know. The teachers are the ones that are doing the work with the kids. They have the most experience. They're the ones that are elbow deep in it every single day, teaching remotely, teaching on a hybrid model, or teaching in person for some of us. And parents as well as students. All of those stakeholders have really, really excellent ideas and feedback that they can give us to help guide those decisions. And it's really important that their voices are at the table through all of this.
So leadership is also giving people a voice at the table. Wow, that's some deep things to think about. Is there any other thing that I haven't asked you? Can you think of it?
I don't think so. I'm just wondering what your experience has been as a parent, and you can answer me later. You don't have to answer me right now.
My listeners know that I am hot, honest, open, and transparent, so I will keep it all the way 1,000. It's been a challenge. We're located in District 2, and we had both our youngest son and an elementary out in District 2, and then we had our oldest in middle school there. And their experience, because I love leadership, i.e. why I started this podcast. So I dissect it, I study it, like from the greatest of all, Jesus Christ to Martin Luther King, everyone in between. And I teach them leadership at home. So the kids I have at the house, they know leadership, and their experience was they started receiving labeling because they learned differently. And that's troubling because I learned differently. And when we get that label enough times, we finally accept that villain. Okay, I'm the villain. I'm going to cause havoc. And they weren't receiving the level of education that they needed. Like, they're really smart, so they like to progress a little bit faster. But when having to, like, okay, you can only go so much, it's very limiting and discouraging. So as a parent, it was a challenge, and we eventually took our kids out of the public school system, and now they're in private school online, and they have a lot more autonomy. And I'm seeing just the difference maker that is. And then now leading a little micro school, I'm seeing it firsthand when I see the kids, when they disengage or they're getting bored. So I'm like, okay, like I can't have them sitting here. Nothing's going to penetrate their heads. So I'm like, okay, we're going to take this learning outside. Mm-hmm. So we just go outside and we have those same conversations, and seeing that kids learn differently, seeing how they receive information, see how they process it, and making it specific for every child is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And I've thought that we had to be just like everyone else, and everyone is different. Everyone learns different. So that's been my experience, both as an educator and as a parent, that everyone learns differently, and how we view them is how they start to view themselves. Mm-hmm. And that, like you said earlier, the empowerment versus disempowerment. Like I tell my kids all the time, and I tell the learners, hey, figure it out. Let me know when you get it. I'm right here. Versus giving them the answers and seeing that aha moment. Like one of the learners, like, I got it. Like those are the most magical words I've ever heard. Mm-hmm. I got it. Thank you. I got it. And seeing them just become empowered. But yeah, that's been our experience of seeing our kids disempowered and seeing learners disempowered, and now seeing them empowered and controlling their education versus their education being controlled.
So what I'm hearing you say is you have found a significant difference between content and context. Mm-hmm. Big time. Yeah. I was thinking about that earlier. I was listening to one of your other podcasts with another interview, and the gentleman was talking about, the challenges right now with teaching content and the learning gaps that we're starting to see. And the realization that I had that I would love to piggyback on that idea with, and he wasn't going in depth in the conversation with it, or otherwise I'm sure he would have touched on some of this too. But it really got me thinking about my own children as well. And I think part of the challenge that we're seeing with the learning gaps right now is that we're not only seeing content learning gaps, we're also talking about changing the educational context for students almost overnight since, last March. So the context used to be, we attend in person, brick and mortar, school all day long with our teacher, depending on grade level, sometimes some teachers, right? Mm-hmm. And now the context has totally changed on us. But we're also not only talking about academic content, we're talking about social emotional content, social skills, and by removing those students from the classroom, we're taking away the opportunities that those students have to work through those experiences, which is how they learn. And that realization came to me the other night with my two little ones, my 4 and my 5-year-old, and they're really missing a friend that they haven't been able to see. And they said, can we call? And so I said, sure, let's call. And we called, and immediately, I put the cell phone on the table in my dining room, and it was on speakerphone. And the second our friend answered, who happened to be an adult, thankfully, you could just tell the conversation was totally being overran by a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. And they started talking over each other, and there were no social skills involved whatsoever. And I thought, holy moly, we need to hang up this phone right now and do a lesson on telephone etiquette. because this is just not working. And I would not want to be on the other end of that line listening to this arguing that's happening, but that's really what it's about. And that's maybe a bad example, but it can be applied.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing those learning gaps happening in academic content, but we're also taking away a lot of other opportunities that students would be participating in, socially. Like things like personal space.
Yeah.
That's a thing. Personal space is a thing. And when you're surrounded by your family all the time, personal space isn't as big of an issue. But when you're in a classroom, personal space is a big issue, So those are some of the things that are also being impacted by a lot of these changes in education. And so in doing so, the question then becomes, how are we going to respond to this?
Mm-hmm.
What's another way that we can go about making sure that this content is maybe being taught inside another context?
Mm-hmm. I like that. And I think another thing is what I've learned over the last couple of weeks of doing this school is that there are outside things that are going on that impacts internally. So understanding where the child is coming from, who the child is, and where they want to be. It talked about social emotional learning. I think that's so needed right now because, when I was younger, I was labeled a troubled youth, but my father wasn't in the home. My mom worked like 60 hours, so I barely saw her. My sister was like my mom. We had no food, so I wasn't able to actually process things and think about things thoroughly. And the landlord would constantly come to the home, and I knew we were going to get evicted soon enough. So like thinking about, okay, do I quit school to help my family out, or do I continue? So all of those things going on in the background, and then we expect them to learn while these things the kids are thinking about that.
Sure.
But understanding their background in a social emotional, like helping them process things and get through things and talk about things, not just helps them academically, but help them personally. And with those two things makes learners become more whole versus coming into the real world and not having those skills, those soft skills. So I definitely see a huge pivot coming with the social emotional learning and helping students process those things. But with that, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me. It's been awesome. And I really enjoyed being here and talking with you. And I hope your listeners can at least find a few takeaways that they can go and apply.
I'm pretty sure they will. Just press pause, rewind this podcast. It's the power of the internet radio. We've left traditional radio and we're on the internet. But thank you again, Crystal, for being with us today.
My pleasure, David.
Thank you. So thank you all for joining us today. Come back every other Wednesday for a new episode. And I want you to remember something. If we as leaders are to set ourselves apart, we must start by leading through love, which always comes from the heart.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Leadership Revolution podcast. We hope you were blessed. We value feedback from our listeners, so please leave a comment letting us know what you found helpful, challenging, or left you wanting to know more. New Leadership Revolution messages will be released every other Wednesday. Hit subscribe to be sure not to miss out. To stay in the know on our latest news, events and initiatives, follow Shepherd Revolution on Instagram, TikTok and Facebook. Thank you again for coming on this journey with us. We love you, and as you go about the rest of your day, we bless you to lead from your heart.